Okay, so my name is Brittany Gannon. I also do go by Ray here for those who do not know. And again, I'm going to really talk about loneliness among the population of adults aging with HIV, particularly in rural North Central Florida, and looking at the social and geographic context. So here are some of the objectives I'd like to cover today. I'm not going to go over them since that's a little bit redundant. But I do want to situate you as to where I started. So I was probably 22 years old, a little baby nurse here. And when I was working at bedside, you're brand new and you're out on a medical surgical floor. I had my first experience really witnessing stigma. And I had a patient who was in an AIDS-related coma. So she wasn't able to provide consent. She had family and friends surrounding her at bedside. There were pictures, there was music, people were holding her hands and massaging them. And what I witnessed in this incident is a training clinician came in and said, you know your loved one is like this because she has AIDS, right? After that incident, I witnessed complete abandonment of the family. The pictures were gone, the music was gone, the patient was left to send to hospice alone. During that same time, I also witnessed many medical staff on the floor in my own surgical unit here, basically put on gloves, cap, gown, face shields to basically give her a bed bath. And so a lot of these things really stuck with me and facilitated and really just pushed me forward into my desire to study HIV amongst the aging population. She was also, I should say, in her 60s. So background on this, globally, adults 50 and above are the very first and also the largest growing cohort to age with HIV. And that's in large part due to the amazing advancements that we have had in antiretroviral therapies. So along with the physical health longevity concerns, there's also many other socioeconomic and mental health concerns that we need to consider when treating and or addressing this population at large. So to date, social networks of adults aging with HIV have been described in the literature as fragmented and fragile, and they've also been described as a buffer to or a perpetuator of stigma. And particularly to the rural dwelling environment, we see often lower levels of education, older age, increased geographic distance, limited mobility, and lack of formal and informal HIV-related resources. And if you guys know anything about Florida, that's where the snowbirds go, the retirees. So beginning this journey, I did a review of the literature to kind of see what was done. So I did a rural-urban comparison looking at social networks of adults who were aging with HIV. And what I found back when I published this in 2016 was that there might have been less than 5 studies that were actually conducted focusing on this topic. And all of these studies at that time point were actually done outside of the United States. So I was really interested to see, what this rurality component might have contributed to the picture. And what we found that unique to rurality, there was a lack of available networks. Again, they had this increase in geographic distance and issues with mobility. We don't have subways and various forms like ferries and things. So we really just have our buses, and there's not buses that go county to county. There was also lack of tangible and emotional support reported from these adults living with HIV within their current and actual networks, more fear of disclosure, as well as, interestingly, this fear of violation of confidentiality in the healthcare setting. Of course, we all know stigma is a hot topic, and it has a lot of impacts on the outcomes of our patients and the people that we serve. So stigma impacted a lot. Disclosure of one's HIV status, fragmented networks again, this lack of social support, and it was found to perpetuate loneliness and isolation in this population. So overall, the purpose of this mixed methods study was to evaluate the impact of social network components on loneliness among adults aging with HIV in the setting of their rural physical environment. So how I applied a theoretical model was I conceptualized this at multiple levels. And I said, really, what do I want to study here? And how do I want to do it? And that's where the mixed method model came to unfold. As I said, I want to look at, the actual impact on loneliness, but I want to look at the interpersonal factors, because that bedside experience, like how did one's family leave them, and all of these things that trickle down to loneliness. So I decided to use social network analysis. And then at the community level, I said, I'm in this rural setting, in this community, what's different here? So I decided to use the GIS as a form to apply that method of analysis. So when we talk about this exchange they're in, there's a social geographic exchange. So there's a synergistic pathway in which one social world occurs. So I like to call it the environment sets the stage. What we have access to and what we're privy to in our interpersonal as well as capital exchange, and that can mean financial resources, that can mean emotional support, has in large part due to the stage that we're in. So we're in New York City. We have the ability to commute all over the place. We meet so many different people. It's a very diverse population here. It's a little bit different when we talk about a rural-based setting, even how we can travel and communicate with others. Also, how one individual actually perceived their rurality can actually impact how they experience their social world. So this pop-out here was mapped by myself. This is area 313, and it's a 15-county district that's actually defined by the Ryan White organization, whereby federal funds are distributed, and for this particular county. And so Gainesville, Florida is right here, kind of like dead kind of north center of the state. And this county particularly was interesting because when I ran some of the basic or looked at the basic statistics that have been going on, 50% of those individuals in this 15-county region in 2015 were actually accounted for 50% of the total, prevalence rates of individuals living in this area. So about half of the people living there were 50 and above. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like, and these are the pretty pictures too. In terms of housing units, this is pretty standard. And there's not a lot of people, you don't see housing. So these are pretty dispersed, spread out. It's also a big farming community, lots of beautiful hiking and areas in spring. So that's kind of the activities I used to do prior to moving here. So in taking this message home today, I hope by telling you about how this mixed methods process was done in my study that will really show you who comprises the networks and what networks look like, where these individuals are living and kind of what that looks like for them, as well as their stories, so the what part of the narrative. So I employed a convergent mixed methods study design. It sounds really fancy, but there's 4 major steps and it's really not. So step 1 is concurrent data collection. So basically I sat down, and when I implemented my 3 surveys, followed by a follow-up semi-structured interview, I did it at one time point. And the reason for doing that is because, again, this is a population that is notoriously a little bit harder to reach. So they're traveling far distance. Maybe they don't have enough socioeconomic resources. And so we have to take all of that into consideration when we're designing our studies for the population at large. So the first scale that I implemented was the sociodemographic GIS information survey, and big fancy word for what is your age, race, sex, ethnicity, how long have you lived with HIV? And I also asked them questions, where do you currently live? As well as, are you accessing healthcare, and where do you access your primary HIV care services? So when they told me these answers, I would pull up on Google Maps and find the latitude and longitude and show them and have them confirm that that was the address. I want to make note here to protect anonymity. They didn't have to tell me their exact address. And of course, I encourage you can do nearest cross-section. And if you don't want to answer, you can skip that as well. The second instrument was the de Jong loneliness scale, which was an 11-item 5-point Likert scale. And it was an ordinal scale measuring social as well as emotional loneliness to combine like a total score. And it was a scale ranging from ordinal, so not at all likely to very likely. And then the last questionnaire I implemented was the personal network questionnaire, which was designed by myself. I used an open name generator, which means I said, name 20 people that you know who also know you, that you've communicated with over the past 2 years, either by phone, Facebook, email, it doesn't matter. So you can't name Oprah Winfrey in this case unless you really did know her. I did have someone say, and I had to say, do you really know Oprah? So for the name interpreter section, similarly, I asked demographics of their population, age, race, sex. Do you know if this person also has HIV? As well as some social capital questions. How much do you trust this person? Again, that was on a 5-point Likert scale. Would you talk to this person if you needed financial support, emotional support, and so forth? And then the last section, the name interrelator section, basically asks the question, hey, you said Paul over here was a friend. How likely does Paul know Ryan, independently of you? So that could have meant Paul and Ryan met once, they're out at Walmart, they run into each other, they would start up a conversation. So after completion of that questionnaire, this is what the participants saw. For the purpose of this presentation, I removed the names, which are commonly next to the shapes that you see here. So they can say, oh yeah, that's Ryan. I talked to him about my HIV. So what I did is with this follow-up semi-structured interview, I'd say, okay, so it looks like there's a group over here and they're completely disconnected from this group. And it looks like you identified that these are a lot of your friends. You know, can you tell me about that group a little bit more? And do you talk to them about your HIV? And so we really got into those why questions. So step 2 of this process, independent analysis of each data set. And it is a lot. So how you do this, just like you do any other analyses, is you use the appropriate methods to analyze each appropriate data set. In this case, it was network data, a little bit of qualitative data, as well as some of the GIS data. So I'm going to give you an overall picture of the demographics of this study. It was kind of an exploratory pilot study, or it was. So there was a total N of 30. 60% of the population was age 50 to 60, which you're going to see representative of the national sample today. 70% of my population was male. About 50% was white Caucasian. I had 46% equally who identified as heterosexual and homosexual. 43% of them who also identified as being married and or in a committed relationship. So the numbers up here, we have a total score here of 53.3% of adults who had lived with HIV for 16 plus years. But those numbers were pretty high. Highest level of education obtained was 63.3% high school in this community, as well as 53.3% made less than $15,000 annually per year. So here's a unfortunately distorted picture of Area 313. I'm sorry you can't see these counties here. That's represented right now based on population density, how many people are living in that area per square acre. So this canary yellow basically is telling you that there are 0 to 1 person per acre living in this area. So this is really, really rural. Lots of land, what we saw. And what you see up here, these darker shades, so the oranger you go, this darkest shade is 8 to 14 per acre. So when we look at this, this is actually, again, in Gainesville, Florida, that's the university. So that's why you're going to have that skewed distribution there. When we look at percent of the population who are living below poverty, again, the darker shade is representing 40 to 60% of that population in that region living below poverty. When we look at this here, we see some darker coloring up here, as well as dispersed in these pockets throughout these regions of the rural areas. Breaking it down even further, when we look at racial and ethnic distribution, on the right-hand side of the screen, this is the breakdown of the white Caucasian population. So you see a lot of the darker color shades here. This darker purple reflects 90 to 100% of the people living in that area identified from the census statistics back in 2016 that they were white Caucasian. So we see that commonly in rural environments. You have more homogeneous or pockets where there's not only poverty, but groups of just one racial background. And what you see over here in the darker shades of purple and from the lighter is our Black African American communities. Now I want to point out something quickly. Up here we have this pocket of the really dark area, so about 60 to 100% of people in these little pockets here that are outlined are Black African American. Now when I go back and show you the areas which are darker in terms of distribution of poverty, this is a disproportionately higher rate of individuals who are impoverished in this sub-community who identify as Black African American. And what's not plotted here, unfortunately, is that when we talk about distribution of healthcare resources, where the healthcare site was, a majority of participants traveled to, was in Alachua County over here. And so when you have patients traveling on a bus about 10 miles over to get to the health department, and they live over here, we're not doing a service to our patients when we're making them travel to us and they don't have the funds or the resources or the mobility to do so. Excuse me. So here's a representation of the networks I'm going to talk about today. Traditionally, this is a fragmented network, but I don't want to get in too much on that yet. The shape of the figures are actually representative of who these members were to the participant. So a circle representing a friend, an upward triangle representing a family member, this grayscale coloring from white to black, white being that they never talk to this person about their HIV, black being they always talk to this person about their HIV. And lastly, the size of the shape, not getting too caught up on the language, is representative of degree of betweenness centrality. I like to call these the brokers or the gatekeepers of the network. So if something comes out, they're the person that can rapidly disseminate information if needed. Also, when we look at density, again, I don't want you to get caught up in the language. It's just what you see here. How many connections do alters have, which are the people that were named amongst one another independently of the participant? So step 3 in this process was direct comparison of the data set. I did that through a version what we call joint display. And what I did was bring up all the data again after the independent analyses, and I said, okay, here's the network, here's the qualitative narrative and the themes, and here's some of the GIS data as well as the loneliness scale. What am I seeing? I'm looking if things relate. Do they diverge? Are they making the story and the narrative more holistic, or are things popping out and am I capturing things that I didn't see before? And then the last step of this process is discussion of the way things relate, converge, diverge, or enhance results. And today I'm going to present it through a process of what we call weaving. And weaving is just like a narrative format. And I'm going to hopefully tie some things together to contribute to the narrative. Interestingly, what came across the data, and I will say I did not ask a single question about stigma in any of the surveys. Not one. And a lot of people alluded to when I said, hey, it looks like you talked to this person about your HIV, why this group, or, tell me a little bit more about that. A lot of the things that came out from the qualitative data differently was that the sense of loneliness and these feelings of isolation and the desire to disclose and talk about their HIV more were perpetuated by this lack of disclosure due to fear of rejection, because of intersectional stigma, due to which further perpetuated lack of support, and in some cases living a double life or protected silence. So I call this the vicious cycle of loneliness. So Carl is representative of what we see in this community as a faith-based network. So Carl is in his mid-60s. He identified as a Black male who had lived with HIV for over 20 years. He identified as a gay homosexual man, though he was non-disclosing to his community. All members really that he named in his community were what we call homogenous. So predominantly he had all church members, either people in the church, his pastor, besides this little pocket over here, which are his friends that didn't go to church. And so, this is also, not saying that anything less of those people, but when we broke it down in the qualitative interview, I said, wow, Carl, you don't disclose your HIV to anyone. There's no shades of any gray. It's just all white. And he said, yeah, that's because I'm Seventh-day Adventist. I'm a member of this church, and it's an abomination to be gay. And it's also, if I'm not going to disclose my HIV because then they're going to figure out what's going on. And these people I trust. They provide me emotional support. They give me financial support. Anything I need, I can go to these individuals in my community. Now, when we look at this, and I said, wow, Carl, he had a therapeutic unfolding, almost brought to tears when he was interviewing with me. He really was able not only to visually confirm or what we call validate the network structure, but he's able to tell me his story. He gave me the why as to the disclosure patterns were the way they were. He said, I wish I could tell my network of my condition, but I would feel ostracized. No one in my church community knows about my HIV or my sexual orientation. And when we go back to the gatekeepers of his network, altar number 4 and 3, this is altar number 4. That's his pastor. So if his pastor found out, he's the gatekeeper in this entire network here. So if he found out and the pastor did disseminate that information or tell other people, his entire social world is threatened from what he knows it today. All of his support systems, gone. So again, this is just touching on some of the stigma that came across all of the interviews. We had anticipatory, which was Carl's statement there. Internalize, which a member said, this is my cancer. I'm living with it every day. This is my mark of shame. When an individual alluded to living a double life, he said, I am he and I am she. They don't know that. I feel like they can't handle that and will reject me. Jill. Jill is an example of a family, friend-centric network. Everything looks, pretty unison here. Everyone's connected to everyone again. So when we look at Jill, she identified as a mid-50-year-old white female who had lived with HIV for over 10 years. She did identify as heterosexual, and she was in a serial discordant relationship. That means her partner did not have HIV, and she did. She was on medication, for those who do want to know. And in terms of her partner, this is this hourglass shape over here. She said, my partner supports me. He helps me, drives me to clinics. He's an A1 rock star boyfriend, right? He's also a gatekeeper. He knows all of her friends, which I'm sorry, these are small circles, triangles here, some family members. Another gatekeeper was her parent actually here, which is number 3, who also had a lot of connections. So her world, everyone knew everyone, and that's how she liked it. And she had about what we would say moderate disclosure of her HIV status in here. So different from her visualization, what I wouldn't have picked up on if I didn't ask the follow-up interview question and say, tell me about your social world. Like, you talked about your partner and everything. She kind of started leading me into this area and said, my partner's supportive, but he doesn't want me to disclose my HIV status. He doesn't want people to know that I have it because then they will treat him differently. And going on, I said, I wish I could talk to more people about it. You feel like I'm alone and I'm lying, but I'm saving myself. So the emergent theme that came out here again, which was really embedded, was this anticipatory stigma and this fear of disclosure, not only for herself, but this protective silence was for her partner and how he may be treated if others found out in their network. And the last case, which is a little bit different, I'm going to do a positive spin on this, is Clara. Clara is a mid-60-year-old Black female who had been living with HIV for nearly 30 years. She self-identified as heterosexual, and she was married in a serial concordant relationship with her partner, who that means he also had HIV. She had a tremendous story, and I can talk a whole seminar on Clara, but basically she had a history of sexual violence, and that's how she contracted HIV in this case. She told me about her PTSD, which led to her substance abuse after this incident, and how she lost her family and her children and had multiple suicide attempts and things throughout her history. But then she described to me later on, this led her to a turning point in her life. Because when I said, Clara, you talk to everybody. And she said, yes, I don't care. I'm going to tell everybody I got HIV. And so I wanted to know why. Why did Clara in particular do this? She said this was her way of taking on her diagnosis and self-actualizing. So she basically said, instead of carrying the shame with me, I got educated. I will never suffer, and when we allude to that turning point, as much as Jesus. I changed my narrative from why me to why not me, and I got involved. I learned about HIV, and I became an educator, a peer navigator, and an advocate. So she's a story of someone who really took on this diagnosis to her advantage and gave her meaning to her life. So another alternative to this was we identified moving beyond one's diagnosis, because not everyone's Clara, right? That's the model, what we want, everyone to be like Clara. And in order to do either of these things, identified this acceptance of self, and that could include one's sexuality, but also how one contracted their HIV, and the fact that they did have HIV had to happen. An example of moving beyond one's diagnosis is, yeah, I'm living with it, big deal. So many other things are killing people, diabetes, obesity. HIV is part of my journey, not my life's journey. An example of acceptance again was accepting my sexuality was hard, but I had to embrace it. And in regard to one's infection status, how I got it should not matter. So putting this all together, every single network, every single story is vastly different and is vastly unique. And I hope that I've conveyed today that using this mixed methods tool, I was really able to understand various levels and explore this population because I had no idea what was going on. But what I did find across all of these narratives and stories was that stigma is still this omnipresent phenomenon that we are still trying to get a hold of. And it impacts literally everything. How one navigates their social world and with the people that they identify in their network, their experiences of loneliness, disclosure of their HIV status, and the perpetuating this protected silence. And also going back to the GIS piece, I want to bring home that we still have these pockets of poverty distributed across the US, no doubt, but in these rural areas where we also have lower distribution in samples and how we have less healthcare centers spread out, we need to do a better job at servicing the communities that are in highest need. And by doing that, when we look at county level census data, sometimes we wash out those pockets that are in greatest need. So analyzing the data from the GIS perspective at more of a smaller scale and breaking those numbers down. And then lastly, by using a mixed methods process, the network data really told me who is in the network and what the network structures look like, what the narratives were, and that unfolding of stigma, as in where, under what conditions that these social environments are happening. And this is one of my favorite boardwalks. I'd like to thank the Gainesville Area AIDS Project, as well as the Pride Community Center of North Central Florida and PEP Club, Positives Empowering Positives. These are the only organizations in that 15 county district for members who are somewhere along the sexuality spectrum and or identified as HIV positive, just to point that out. So a lot of people did come and travel to the main university area. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it off?
I don't know if there's a question exactly. You mentioned how
People that have said where they travel to is because they didn't trust the intelligence, if you will, of the physician or the ability of the physician in those environments. As well, they were like, hey, I'm a Sal's daughter that works at that health department, and then everyone's going to find out that I might be taking this type of travel. Some of the ways to travel into Gainesville, which may be a 2-hour road for the parents. So we get your way, stress, and for the most part, I didn't have that question. It did not.
Dr. Shiau, who has trained in public health and epidemiology from both Johns Hopkins and Columbia. She got an MPH and PhD here at Columbia.
Yes.
She's currently a post-doctoral research scientist in the Suggestion Center at UNC. A lot of us love seeing her professor's name. Was here from the beginning of our HIV center and very much part of our center. She's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Community Health and Social Medicine at CUNY School of Medicine. Her interdisciplinary research program studies the effects of HIV and its treatment over the life course, aiming to identify modifiable factors that influence trajectories of HIV-associated non-AIDS conditions in children, adolescents, and adults living with HIV. So we're looking forward to your talk on aging with HIV, growing up, and growing old.
Yes, so thank you for having me. I just put it not on mute. Is it good? Okay. All right. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share some of my research work with you today. I'm going to stand on this side so you can turn your necks the other direction. So my talk today will be focused on growing up and growing old with HIV. So this slide introduces some of the common abbreviations and acronyms that I'll be using in my talk, which are very familiar to this audience. So I'm not going to read all of them, but I do want to highlight one acronym, which is HANA conditions. And that stands for HIV-associated non-AIDS conditions. It's also often referred to as HIV complications or HIV comorbidities. But I will be referring to it as HANA conditions. So here's a roadmap of the topics I'll cover today. First, I'll describe the state of the HIV epidemic and the changing epidemiology of aging with HIV, mostly from a global context, which is a nice compliment. And second, I'll describe the spectrum and burden of HANA conditions over the life course and provide a case example with my own work. Third, I'll demonstrate how epigenetics can be leveraged to understand aging with HIV. And finally, I'll mention some ongoing projects and future directions. So I'll begin by presenting some data from UNAIDS. So this figure shows the number of AIDS-related deaths from 1990 to 2017. It reached a peak of 1.9 million AIDS-related deaths in 2004. ART became available in the early 2000s, and after a slight lag period, the annual number of global deaths from AIDS-related illnesses declined, although it still hovers at about 940,000 and not quite at the 2020 target. So as deaths continue to decline faster than new HIV infections and survival is improving, the number of people living with HIV has increased from 1990 to 2017. And in 2017, it's reached 36.9 million people. During the past 30 years, the life expectancy of the HIV-infected population has also improved substantially. And this figure shows the projected survival of a 20-year-old person with HIV in a high-income country at different time periods. So in the era before ART was available, a person living with HIV at age 20 would only be expected to live a median of 8 additional years. And then once ART did become available, a person living with HIV at age 20 could increase to live an additional 36 years in the early 2000s, up to 55 years in 2010. And this has continued to increase through 2019, and a very similar pattern is seen in low and middle income countries. So with this increase in life expectancy, the number of older adults, 50 years and older, living with HIV has increased in all regions. And you can see in the pink line, it's increased quite dramatically. Let me see if is it the middle button? Oops. Yeah, the pink line is the Southern African region. You can see that that's increased quite dramatically. So as a result, there's been a shift to thinking about aging with HIV. More people with HIV are living into older age due to better ART coverage, improved survival, as well as an increase in new infections among older people. And the consequences of lifelong HIV and ART and chronic inflammation combined with traditional risk factors and diseases of aging have become new territory for HIV programs globally. And in 2016, UNAIDS released this report called Get on the Fast Track, the life cycle approach to HIV, noting the importance of finding solutions for people living with HIV across the lifespan. So thinking about the HIV epidemic at all stages of life is important. If we look at the estimated number of people living with HIV globally in 2017, there's 1.8 million children, 3.9 million young adults, 24.5 million adults, and 6.7 million adults older than 50 years. And given these life expectancy increases that I've shown you, there's soon going to be a really large demographic shift into older adulthood. It's therefore important to consider the long-term consequences of aging, HIV infection, and lifelong ART in combination. So next I'll discuss HANA conditions over the life course. So over the years, popular media has covered the stories of some individuals who live with the virus. And I selected one article from the New York Times to share with you today. It's called People Think It's Over, and it's about this musician named Steve Shacklin, I think here in New York City. So I'm going to read it to you. Steve Shacklin would be the first to tell you he lives in a time of miracles and about how hard that can be. Mr. Shacklin no longer worries about dying of AIDS, but he has other health problems, more often seen in people 10 or 20 years older. Kidney damage, diabetes, chronic fatigue, thyroid disease, partial paralysis in one eye, and general weakness that limits him throughout the day. He has learned, host to a virus that never stops working, grinding away at him and requiring sustained, complicated treatment, each medicine bringing its own side effects. And so here, I've underlined some of the complications or HANA conditions that Mr. Shacklin experienced in this anecdote. So this was just the experience of one individual, but it's quite common in the era of modern antiretroviral therapy. And if we look at population level data, there's an observed increase in these HANA conditions in a treated HIV population. And these conditions include cardiovascular disease, diabetes, COPD, chronic kidney and liver disease, fractures and osteoporosis, neurocognitive disorders, cancers, and frailty. And these diseases are often referred to outside the HIV field as non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases of aging. And in the HIV field, there is evidence to indicate that they appear at both increased rates and at earlier ages. So for a case example, I'm going to focus on bone. So in 2013, we conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis to see if incident fractures were different between adults with HIV and controls. And here are the main findings from that study. So the top shows a forest plot of incident rate ratios for all fractures, and the bottom shows it for fragility fractures. So the pooled estimate of the incidence rate ratio for all fractures was 1.58, meaning that the incident rate of fractures in those with HIV was 1.58 times the incident rate in those without HIV. And it was 1.35 for fragility fractures from a standing height or less. And this provided evidence that adults living with HIV had a moderately increased risk of bone fractures compared to the general population. So these findings of elevated HANA conditions in adults can have implications for those who acquire HIV early in life. So many HANA conditions, like CVD, result from exposure to risk factors that have their origins in childhood. And early manifestations of HANA conditions, which I'll refer to as HANA precursors, are observed in children with HIV. And I show some examples here, including dyslipidemia, elevated blood pressure, decreased bone mineral content, neurodevelopmental delays, lower total brain volume, and decreased renal function in children with HIV. And these children will be exposed to both HIV and ART for their entire life, and we need to think about what the consequences might be with respect to HANA conditions. So I've had the opportunity to study some of these precursors of HANA conditions through a cohort study of school-aged children in Johannesburg, South Africa, called Changes. And this cohort includes 553 children with HIV and 300 controls. The children were 4 to 9 years of age when they were enrolled into the study. The children living with HIV started on ART early, which at that time was less than 2 to 3 years of life. And they were very well characterized because they were participants in a number of randomized trials at the site. And it was conducted at 2 sites in Johannesburg. And our team was able to assess bone health using 3 different imaging methods in this cohort, including DEXA, PQCT, and ultrasound. So I'm just going to show you data from the first 2 approaches. So using DEXA, deficits in bone mineral accrual were detectable in children living with HIV. So this figure shows you the bone mineral content Z-score for the whole body and the lumbar spine by HIV status, with children in HIV in yellow and uninfected children in green. And so to orient you, a z-score of 0 is equal to the mean for the reference population, which is actually based on a US population norm. There were no standards available in South Africa. And negative values are z-scores that fall below the reference population mean. So this BMC z-score, we adjusted it for age, sex, and height. And so we found that whole body BMC z-scores are significantly lower in children with HIV. And these differences remained after adjusting for vitamin D and calcium intake and hours per week of vigorous physical activity. There was no significant difference in lumbar spine BMC z-score between groups. So one thing to note is that the mean z-score for both groups fell below the reference population mean. That's just one thing I did want to point out. And one of the limitations of DEXA is that it only measures integral bone and can't distinguish between different compartments of bone. So to address this, we also measured bone using PQCT. We measured volumetric bone mineral density at the 4% slice of the radius, which is mostly trabecular bone, and the 38% slice of the tibia, which is mostly cortical bone. And this table shows you PQCT data for boys and girls with and without HIV for the 3 measurements, the trabecular volumetric BMD, the cortical VBMD, and polar SSI, which is a measure of bone strength. And we saw decreases in trabecular bone in boys, and we also found decreased bone strength as measured by this bone strength index in both boys and girls. So one of the reasons why a life course perspective for looking at HANA conditions is important is that there may be opportunities for intervening early. And this can be illustrated by the concept of peak bone mass. So in this figure, I'm showing the bone mineral density for an average individual without HIV over the life course. And peak bone mass is defined as the maximum bone mineralization that you reach by your 3rd decade in life. And in later life, peak bone mass is a major determinant of your risk for fracture and osteoporosis. So with HIV infection, either at birth, which is shown in yellow, or during adolescence, which is shown in blue, you can see that there's lower bone mass early in life compared to uninfected populations. And this can disrupt bone accrual during critical periods of skeletal development, compromising your peak bone mass and increasing your later life risk of osteoporosis and fracture. And therefore, optimizing bone accrual in childhood may improve bone health later. So people living with HIV on ART remain at high risk for these HANA conditions. But there's many, many different questions about what pathways through which this occurs. And I've shown on the slide many of the mechanisms and drivers. But persistent immune activation and inflammation likely plays a big role in this increase. So HIV can be used as a model to understand aging. One model is that HIV is an additional risk factor for chronic conditions, and it leads to accentuated aging. So if you look at this figure, it shows the number of cancer cases for people with HIV in the solid line and people without HIV in the dotted line. And accentuated aging is when cancer occurs at the same ages, but more often in people with HIV compared to those without. Another model is that HIV actually leads to premature aging. So you see both accentuated and accelerated aging. So cancer occurs earlier in people with HIV, and there are more events. So studies of HIV populations can provide opportunities to understand the mechanisms that lead to aging and age-related diseases. So over the last few years, I've been using epigenetics as a tool to understand aging with HIV. So this may be a topic new to some people in the room, so I will tell you, what is epigenetics? So exposures can leave a footprint of epigenetic changes across the genome, and these epigenetic changes can alter gene expression without directly changing the DNA base pair code. So in epi studies right now, DNA methylation, epi meaning epidemiology, not epigenetics. In epidemiology studies right now, DNA methylation is the most commonly studied epigenetic change. And it occurs when cytosines in the CPG regions of DNA become methylated. So in the figure on the left, I'm showing you a nucleotide base pair sequence, so the ACTG that you learned in biology. CPG regions, or CPG sites, are regions of DNA with cytosines and guanines, and they're connected by phosphates. So that's the P in CPG. And so methylation occurs when methyl groups attach to the cytosines. So typically, although not always the case, hypermethylation of these CpG sites in the promoter regions of genes can silence genes, and hypomethylation can activate genes. So today I'm going to introduce two methods to incorporate DNA methylation markers into epidemiology studies. The first is using the epigenetic clock as a measure of biological aging. And this method uses the DNA methylation measurements at 353 CpG sites to calculate an estimated epigenetic age. And this epigenetic age can be compared to the chronological age to see if there's age acceleration. So for example, in this figure, we have chronological age on the x-axis and biological age or epigenetic age on the y-axis. And if you look at this individual here who's 70 years of age, they're 70 years chronologically, and they're also 70 years by the epigenetic age. But it's possible that their epigenetic age could be higher, so it could be 90, and that would represent accelerated aging. So if you've ever done those like Facebook things where you take a picture of yourself and it tells you how old you are, it's basically doing the same thing with your epigenetics. So taking a life course perspective, I'll first present what I found in a study of children with HIV, and then I'll compare those results to adult studies. So there are limited studies of accelerated aging in children with HIV, especially those started on ART early in life, who are going to be exposed to lifelong HIV and ART. And the aim of this study is to assess two biomarkers of aging in a cohort of early treated children, and to compare these biomarkers to HIV-exposed uninfected children, so HEUs, and HIV-unexposed uninfected children, so HUUs. And finally, to assess if HIV-related factors are associated with these biomarkers in children living with HIV. So this was a cross-sectional sample from that cohort I showed earlier, the Changes study. The study, and we selected the sample, there were 120 children with HIV. They were virally suppressed below 400 copies. They were all on a lopinavir-ritonavir-based regimen. The sample also included 60 HIV-uninfected children, 33 HEUs, 25 HUUs, and 2 with unknown HIV exposure that we excluded from the analysis. So in terms of measurements, genomic DNA was isolated from Buffy coat samples. Biological aging was evaluated by 2 biomarkers. The DNA methylation levels were measured using the Illumina 450K array, and DNA methylation age was estimated using this most standard method. I can go into more details if people have questions about that, the Horvath method. And we also measured telomere length, but I'm not going to present those results today due to limited time. So for this analysis, the biomarkers were compared between groups. DNA methylation was analyzed using an age acceleration residual. I also adjusted for cell type proportion using a Houseman method. And in the children with HIV, evaluated if the following predictors were associated with the aging biomarkers. So sex, smoke exposure, which was just a question on whether someone in the house smoked cigarettes, time on duration on ART, pretreatment CD4% and viral load, and current CD4 percentage. So this slide shows characteristics of the study sample. Approximately half in each group were male. Mean age was about 6.4 and ranged, as I said, from age 4 to age 9. There were no significant differences in demographic characteristics between the groups, but I do want to point out that about a third in both groups reported that a household member smokes in the household. This slide shows a plot of chronological age on the x-axis, so similar to that example I showed you, and epigenetic age or DNA methylation age on the y-axis. So you can see DNA methylation age was positively and significantly correlated with chronological age, with a correlation of 0.57. This was consistent with what was reported in the original age methylation age study by Horvath et al., but they had really sparse data in our age group, which is highlighted here in the purple oval. So in this figure, we're now looking at the age acceleration by group. So to orient you to the values on the figure, the middle is 0. Positive values indicate accelerated aging. Negative values indicate decelerated aging. So when we looked across the groups, there were no differences in DNA methylation age, even after adjustment for cell type proportions, and all 3 groups were close to 0. So you're probably wondering why I'm showing you a negative study. And the reason why is that the adult study showed something quite different. Before I get to that, when I looked at the analysis of predictors of DNA methylation age, I found that current CD4 percentage and smoke exposure were significantly associated with DNA methylation age among the children living with HIV. So on the left, you see current CD4 percentage was negatively correlated with age acceleration residual. This was in the expected direction with more age acceleration among those with lower CD4 percentage. And then on the right, you see age acceleration residual was higher in those with smoke exposure. So more age acceleration in those exposed to smoke. So in conclusion, there was no difference of accelerated biological aging by DNA methylation age in HIV-infected children who were initiated on ART early. So in adults, a number of reports have shown that HIV infection is associated with accelerated DNA methylation age. And here I'm just showing data from 2 studies. On the left, HIV infection leads to an increase in epigenetic age in 2 different tissues that they measured it in, so in both brain tissue as well as blood. And on the right, both recent and long-term or chronic HIV infection led to an average age acceleration of 4.9 years. So from this, longer follow-up of our cohort of children is needed to see if accelerated aging by DNA methylation age occurs later. It's possible that the negative impact of HIV on DNA methylation age in the children we studied may occur after a longer duration of infection later in life, or that it was possibly prevented with early initiation of ART close to the time of primary infection. So the second method I will introduce is an epigenome-wide association study, or EWAS. And here, DNA methylation can be compared at genome-wide CpG sites between groups. So various Illumina bead chip technologies have come out over the last decade. The number, so Infinium 27 indicates the number of CpG sites on a genome that it covers. So we looked at the Infinium 450K, which is the 450,000 CpG sites. And this method can identify differential methylation at CpG sites at genes that may play mechanistic roles in disease pathogenesis. So I could spend a whole hour talking about this study, and I don't have time to go into the detail today, but I do want to highlight the main results just so you can get an idea of how this method can be applied to epidemiology studies of HIV. And so the aim of this study was to compare DNA methylation profiles in infected and uninfected children. So the same group that you saw previously with the age. And I do want to introduce just this. I used a number of different methods, but I'm just going to present the results from this, which is looking at differentially methylated CpG sites, or DMCs. And in the diagram on the right, you can see a DMC is a single CpG site that's significantly differentially methylated between groups. So this slide shows the primary results of the study. If you haven't seen one before, these are volcano plots, and I'll walk you through it. So each dot on the figure represents one CpG site. The y-axis indicates the p-value, where values higher up or of greater significance. The line over here indicates the FDR false discovery rate significance threshold, which adjusts for multiple comparisons, since there are 486,000 comparisons that are being made. The x-axis has the mean methylation difference between the infected and uninfected groups. So if it's higher, it means it's higher in the HIV-infected group. That's hypermethylation. And if it's lower than 0, it's less methylation in the HIV-infected group, which is hypomethylation. And so the one thing I do want to point out is that there's these 2 vertical lines here. And that's because I set a 5% threshold of mean methylation difference between the 2 groups. Because if I hadn't set that threshold, you could see there would be tons and tons of significant sites. So using a genome-wide approach, I identified 1309 CpG sites that were significantly differentially methylated, more than 5%, between the infected and uninfected children. And these are shown in the red and the blue dots. And if I use the more stringent Bonferroni significance threshold, there would be 69 significant CpG sites. So I do want to highlight 2 sites in particular. One was located on NLRC5, which codes for a receptor that controls transcription of MHC class 1 genes involved in immune function. And this was hypomethylated in the HIV-infected group. And the other was EBF4, which is a transcription factor involved in B cell maturation. And this was hypermethylated in the HIV-infected group. I also found that many of the sites were located on chromosome 6, which contains the major histocompatibility complex, the MHC coding region, So a lot of like the CD4, CD8 T cells are coded by genes in this region, and they govern the immune response. So quickly to compare to two other studies that came out while I was doing my study in kids, two studies in adults. The first was 137 non-Hispanic white men on ART, and the second study was HIV, also 97% men, since it was from a veteran study. And they found the primary finding of the first study was dysregulation of the MHC region, and the primary finding of the second study was that the most significantly differentially methylated site was on the NLRC5 gene. So to summarize, these findings help improve our understanding of HIV disease pathogenesis. My study confirmed methylation differences that were seen in adults in a very different region. So mostly adults in the US compared to, and their mean age was 50, compared to South African children living with HIV with the mean age of 6.4. Second, the study identified potential epigenetic mechanisms through which HIV affects B cells, including EBF4. And finally, the study identified epigenetic changes associated with HIV at a large number of other host genes. So before I finish, I just want to touch on a few of our ongoing projects based on the work I showed in today's talk. So I showed you data from the Changes study in children, which was done in South Africa. And we have ongoing collaborations to study epigenetic age and the epigenome more broadly in young adults, as well as older adults with HIV here in New York City at Columbia in collaboration with Mike Yin, who's here. So SOBA Old is a study of adults over age 60 with and without HIV, and we'll be able to look at the association between epigenetic age and two HANA conditions, so frailty and cognitive impairment. SOBA Young is looking at young adults with HIV, and we'll have measures of cognition, as well as a pilot study of MRI scans. And finally, we have a new study to look at blood pressure patterns in young adults with HIV, and we'll be exploring whether sleep disturbances and psychosocial stressors contribute to blood pressure patterns. And so these studies at different points in the life course will help improve our understanding, hopefully, of accelerated aging in HIV. So just the take-home points from the talk. First, ART has transformed HIV into a chronic condition, and life expectancy for people living with HIV has increased, and the demography of people living with HIV will continue to change, and there will be many aging with HIV. Second, in the modern treatment era, HANA conditions, such as cardiovascular disease, fractures, osteoporosis, neurocognitive impairment, are observed in people living with HIV, and precursors of these conditions are seen in children. And third, DNA methylation and epigenetic marker can be integrated into epi studies to understand the effects of HIV and ART on HANA conditions over the life course. And I highlighted the two methods that are commonly used. So thank you for your attention. This work was made possible by many cohorts, collaborators, and mentors, many mentors, including Mike Yin, that I've worked with, as well as funding from NIH and pilot grants here at Columbia. So thank you.
Another great talk. I think you're both great.